The alarms were already screaming when they threw her out. Emily Brooks stood in the hallway of Blackstone Military Medical Center, her hands still gloved, her chest still heaving, and watched the trauma team move through the reinforced doors without her. Inside, a soldier was dying. Not from the bullet wound. That was manageable. He was dying from something invisible, something classified, something she had seen once before in a forward operating base in the Kandahar Valley where 3 men never came home. She knew exactly what was killing him. And the man holding the scalpel didn't believe her. Nobody in that room had any idea that the greatest danger wasn't on the other side of those doors. It was already inside, wearing surgical gloves and a god complex the size of the building. If this story has you hooked already, hit that like button, follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. The morning had started the way most bad days do, quietly. Emily arrived at Blackstone Military Medical Center at 6:40, 20 minutes before the start of her shift, because she had never once been the kind of person who rolled in at the last second. It wasn't a habit she'd developed at nursing school. It came from something older. 3 years in the United States Army, 2 of them forward deployed, all of them teaching her that the difference between early and on time was the difference between alive and not. Redwood Falls was not Kandahar. She reminded herself of that regularly. The hospital cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and industrial lemon cleaner, not diesel and sand. The people rushing past her in the corridor were carrying clipboards, not rifles. Nobody here was going to step on a pressure plate walking to the bathroom at 3 in the morning. Still, old habits. She stopped at the locker room, changed into her scrubs, clipped her ID badge to the chest pocket, and stood at her locker for a moment longer than necessary. The photo she'd taped to the inside of the door was small. 4 soldiers in body armor, squinting against the sun, somewhere outside Helmand Province. She was the only woman in the frame. All 4 were grinning like idiots. One of them wasn't smiling anymore. Marcus had been gone for 2 years. Friendly fire. Wrong coordinates, wrong moment, wrong universe. Emily shut the locker. The trauma ward at Blackstone was one of the few civilian hospitals in the country with a dedicated military trauma unit, a consequence of its proximity to Fort Carver and a Department of Defense contract that nobody on the administrative floor ever stopped congratulating themselves for securing. It meant the ward saw things most ERs never touched: blast injuries, shrapnel patterns that defied standard wound classification. Men and women who arrived in civilian clothes but carried injuries that told a very different story. Emily had worked this floor for 14 months. She was good at her job. She knew she was good at her job. The problem, she had learned, was that knowing it and getting anyone above the charge nurse level to agree were 2 entirely different propositions. She was 30 years old. She looked younger. She was a woman. She was a nurse, not a physician. In the hierarchy of Blackstone Military Medical Center's trauma wing, those 4 facts placed her somewhere between the vending machine and the rolling supply cart in terms of how seriously her observations were taken. Most days, she made peace with that. Today was not most days. The trauma alert came in at 7:14, a priority military transport, inbound ETA 11 minutes, nature of injury classified. Emily was already at the nursing station when the call hit. She looked at the board, noted the classification flag, and felt something shift in the back of her mind. A classified transport at this hour, through their facility rather than the base hospital, meant whatever had happened was either too severe to wait for the military facility's surgical team, or there was a reason the base didn't want it documented through their own chain. Neither possibility was reassuring. She began pulling the trauma bay together without being asked, checked the crash cart, verified the airway kit, did a quiet visual inventory of the medication drawer, and then paused. She opened the drawer again, looked at the atropine supply, looked at the pralidoxime on the shelf above. Something. She wasn't sure what. Call it instinct. Call it pattern recognition built from 18 months treating blast and chemical casualties in a combat zone where the enemy had access to things that weren't supposed to exist. She pulled 1 additional vial of atropine and placed it on the tray. Nurse Tara Hensley came up beside her, younger, 2 years out of school, still carrying that particular brand of nervous energy that hadn't been worn down yet. "What are you thinking?" Tara asked, watching her. "Probably nothing. Emily said it the way you say things you don't actually believe. The transport came in hot. Paramedics moving fast, too fast for a standard gunshot case, their hands controlled but their eyes giving away something Emily recognized. They'd seen something they weren't sure how to explain. The patient was male, mid-30s, close-cropped hair, a physique that said operator before any documentation did. The visible wound was a through and through to the left shoulder. Survivable, clean, the kind of injury you stabilize and ship. It was not by itself a reason for the way the two paramedics were holding their breath. Emily moved to the head of the gurney. She looked at his pupils, both dilated unevenly. She looked at the skin around the wound. There was a faint mottling, a pattern she'd have missed if she hadn't known what to look for. His respiratory rate was elevated, irregular. His jaw had a tension to it that wasn't pain response. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. The pulse was wrong, not weak. Wrong. Erratic in a specific way, a cascading pattern rather than a flat arrhythmia. Her stomach dropped. She'd seen this before. Not in a hospital. In a field tent outside a village that didn't appear on any public map, with a special forces medic working next to her who kept saying, "We don't have what we need. We don't have what we need," while 2 men died anyway. "Who treated him first?" she asked the paramedics, keeping her voice even. "Scene was locked down. We picked him up at the handoff point. That's all we have." "What was the call-out location?" "Classified." Dr. Nathan Mercer entered the trauma bay at that moment the way he always entered rooms. Slightly ahead of everyone else, slightly louder, taking up the space before assessing whether it needed to be taken. He was 46 years old, board-certified in trauma surgery, and had been chief of surgical services at Blackstone for 3 years. He was not, as far as Emily could tell, a bad surgeon. He was, however, a profoundly certain man. Certainty in surgery was useful. Certainty that foreclosed on information from people you considered beneath you was something else entirely. He scanned the patient, looked at the wound, looked at the vitals on the monitor, and made his determination in approximately 8 seconds. Shoulder penetration, hemodynamically stable, no spinal involvement indicated. Let's get him into OR2 and close this up. He was already moving toward the door. "Dr. Mercer." Emily's voice was steady. "I don't think this is a standard GSW." Mercer stopped. Not because he was concerned, because something in her tone required him to stop. He turned and looked at her with the particular expression senior physicians reserved for moments when someone below them said something they were going to have to address before moving on. "Nurse Brooks, look at the pupils, the mottling at the wound margins. His respiratory pattern is elevated. He's in pain and he's been in transit. His pupils are consistent with analgesic administration." The paramedics didn't administer any analgesics. A brief beat. He looked at the paramedics. They shook their heads. Mercer looked back at the monitor, then at Emily. "His BP is holding. The wound is the presenting injury. We treat the wound. I think there's a secondary exposure, the skin pattern, the pulse irregularity. I've seen this before, with organophosphate compounds, and not in a clinical setting." She kept her voice clinical. She kept her tone respectful. She was very careful with both of those things. "I'd recommend we hold on standard anesthesia and run a tox screen before we open him up." The trauma bay had gone quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when a confrontation is developing and everyone present has already calculated their own proximity to the fallout. Mercer set down the chart. "You've seen this before," he repeated, and the way he said it was the way you repeat something to make it sound foolish. "In your field experience." "Yes." "Emily." He used her first name. That was always the signal. "I don't know what they taught you in the Army about improvised toxicology diagnoses, but this is a hospital. What I see in front of me is a shoulder wound with elevated vitals consistent with stress response and a patient who needs surgery. What I don't see is any basis for you to second-guess a surgical plan based on..." He paused, and he chose the next word deliberately. "Intuition." There was a sound somewhere in the room. Tara exhaled just slightly too fast. Someone adjusted a tray unnecessarily. Emily looked at the patient on the gurney. His jaw was still tight. The mottling hadn't faded. "I'm not asking you to delay surgery indefinitely. I'm asking you to run a tox panel and modify the anesthesia protocol in case..." "Security." Mercer said it without looking away from her. then to the room at large in a voice that had moved past reasonable into something deliberate. "You're a nurse. You don't make surgical calls on my trauma team. Stay out of my operating room." He looked at the guard by the door. "Please escort Nurse Brooks to the corridor." She didn't fight it. Fighting it would have been the wrong move, and she knew it, and she walked out with her back straight and her hands at her sides and didn't let her face do anything she'd regret. The doors sealed behind her. She stood in the corridor and breathed. Down the hall, a man in a field jacket was sitting in one of the plastic chairs against the wall, the ones reserved for family, though he didn't look like family. He was watching the trauma bay doors with an expression that was very flat and very controlled. He had the same close-cropped hair as the patient inside. The same build, the same particular stillness that people carried when they had trained themselves not to move unless there was a reason. Emily walked toward him. "You were with him," she said. He looked at her ID badge, said nothing. "I'm the nurse they just threw out of there." She kept her voice low. "I think your teammate has a chemical exposure on top of the GSW. I need to know what he was around in the last 12 hours. He studied her for a long moment. Something in her face, or her posture, or the fact that she'd said teammate rather than patient, made him decide. "The device they were extracting," he said. His voice was almost no volume at all. "New deployment, thermobaric shell with a secondary dispersal layer. We thought it was incendiary. Our CBRN readout wasn't calibrated for the compound they used." She felt the cold move through her very precisely. "Organophosphate-based?" He nodded once. "What compound? Do you know?" "Something new. We flagged it in the after action. Our medic on scene used standard nerve agent protocol. Atropine, 2 milligram dose." "Did it stabilize him?" "Temporarily." The man looked at the doors. "Then we got here." Emily turned back toward the trauma bay. Through the small reinforced window in the door, she could see movement. The team preparing, Mercer at the head of the table. She could see the anesthesiologist. She recognized Dr. Paula Reist from the way she moved, beginning the pre-op sequence. Standard protocol for standard anesthesia. She moved to the intercom panel beside the door and pressed the call button. "Dr. Mercer, stop. You need to hold on the standard anesthetic. He has an organophosphate exposure. If you go in with standard agents, the interaction will—" Mercer's voice came back flat through the speaker. "Get her off this floor. Listen to me. Give him atropine before you put him under. High-dose atropine. It's not protocol, but it's escort her out." Different voice now. Someone else on the floor. She pressed the button again. 2 milligrams won't be enough. He needs a full reversal series or the anesthesia will trigger a cascading cholinergic—" The intercom cut off. She turned. 2 security personnel were walking toward her with the practiced, unhurried pace of people who had been called to do a job and intended to do it without incident. The soldier in the field jacket had stood up. Emily looked at the monitor visible through the window. The patient's heart rhythm on the screen. Steady for now. Steady and wrong. And she was the only person in this building who understood exactly how wrong. She pressed the intercom one more time. "Stop the anesthesia. Give him atropine, please." The security guards reached her. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to—" And then every alarm in the trauma bay went off simultaneously. She looked through the window. The monitor was doing what she had known it was going to do. The rhythm collapsing in exactly the pattern she had predicted. The flat line hitting the screen like an accusation directed at every person who had told her to be quiet. Inside the bay, she could see the team scrambling. She could see Mercer. And for the first time since he'd walked into that room, he did not look certain. The security guards had stopped. They were looking at the doors. Emily looked at the doors. Then she looked at the elevator at the end of the corridor, where the light had just activated and the floor indicator was descending toward them. The doors opened. The man who stepped out was not a doctor, not a hospital administrator, not anyone who belonged in this hallway at 7:30 in the morning. He was in dress uniform, Army, 4 stars on the shoulder, flanked by 2 armed escorts who cleared the hallway with a visual sweep before the general had even finished stepping through the elevator doors. He looked at the security guards. He looked at the alarms still screaming through the trauma bay doors. He looked at the man in the field jacket, who straightened slightly. Then he looked at Emily, at the ID badge, at her hands, still in gloves, still ready. Are you the nurse they removed from that room? His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Her answer came without hesitation. Yes, sir. He looked at the doors. He looked at the monitor visible through the window. The flatline, the scrambling team, the surgeon who had just lost control of a situation he hadn't understood. Can you save him? She didn't blink. Yes. The general looked at the guards, then at the closed doors. Then he walked toward them with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. And as his hand reached the door, Emily was already right behind him, atropine in hand, because she had never once stopped being ready. The general's hand hit the door before anyone thought to stop him. He didn't push it open dramatically. He didn't need to. He simply applied pressure and walked through, and the door swung wide, and for one suspended second the entire trauma bay froze. The circulating nurse mid-reach, the scrub tech holding a retractor he hadn't been asked for yet, Dr. Paula Reist with her hand on the anesthesia flow valve, and every single person in that room felt the atmosphere change the way you feel a pressure drop before a storm. General Adrian Wolfe stood at the threshold and looked at the monitor first, then at the patient, then at Nathan Mercer. Who is in charge of this room? Mercer turned. He had the expression of a man who had been caught doing something that wasn't wrong, but who understood, in this particular moment, that he was about to be treated as if it were. I'm the Chief of Surgical Services, Dr. Nathan Mercer, and I need you to… Is this man still alive? Yes, but we're managing a… Is he stable? We're working on restoring… That's a no. Wolfe stepped fully inside. His escort stayed at the door. He didn't look at them. He looked at Mercer. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Do you know what compound is in his system? Mercer's jaw tightened. There's no confirmed toxicological, so… Do you know what compound is in his system? The silence lasted 3 seconds. That was enough. Wolfe turned to the door. Emily. She was already moving. She came through the door and went directly to the patient without looking at Mercer, without looking at anyone except the monitor and the man on the table. His color had shifted. The mottling had spread from the wound margin up toward the clavicle, and the rhythm on the screen was doing something ugly, a pattern of jagged irregularity that was going to resolve into flatline again within minutes if nobody intervened correctly. I need 2 milligrams atropine, IV push, right now. She was already checking his pupils again. Worse than before. She looked at Reist. What did you give him for induction? Reist glanced at Mercer reflexively, the kind of glance that was a habit, a hierarchy check, and then she looked at Wolfe, and something decided in her face. Propofol. 50 milligrams. Emily absorbed that without reacting. Propofol and an organophosphate load. That was the interaction, the suppression of the already compromised autonomic response, cascading straight into cardiac arrest, not malpractice in any universe where Mercer's read on the patient had been correct, but his read had not been correct. Okay. She kept her voice even, flat, not because she wasn't scared, but because scared didn't help the man on the table. I need the atropine. I need pralidoxime. Do we have pralidoxime on this floor? Crash cart. Tara's voice from the doorway. She'd followed. She had the presence of mind to have already grabbed the cart from the corridor, and she wheeled it through now, not making eye contact with Mercer, not making eye contact with anyone except Emily. Good. Emily took the atropine that someone pressed into her hand, she didn't see who, and administered it without hesitation. We're going to need repeat doses. This isn't a one-push situation. The compound he was exposed to has a long half-life, and the standard 2 milligrams won't. You don't have authorization to administer, Mercer started. Dr. Mercer. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Step back from the table. This is my operating room. She is a nurse. She does not have surgical authority, and if she administers medications without physician oversight, she's practicing. Step back from the table. Same volume, same tone, not a repetition, a wall. Mercer stepped back. He didn't do it gracefully. His face went through several things in quick succession: disbelief, fury, calculation, and then settled into a cold stillness that was its own kind of warning. He stepped back and crossed his arms and stood against the wall and watched. And something about the quality of his watching made the back of Emily's neck prickle even while she was working. She pushed it down. Later, the pralidoxime came from the crash cart, and she ran it through a secondary IV line, talking quietly as she worked. Not to the room, not performing for anyone, just the low, ongoing murmur of a person who thinks out loud under pressure and has learned not to be embarrassed about it. Okay? Reactivation window is narrow. You're probably already past the optimal point, but we try anyway. We always try. Atropine is buying time. But the underlying, watch that rhythm. Watch it there. The monitor spiked. Not in a good way. The heart was trying to respond to the atropine and the organophosphate load was pushing back, and for about 40 seconds the QRS complex on the screen was doing something that made Reese say, "Oh God," under her breath. Emily adjusted the drip rate. She didn't look away from the monitor. "Talk to me," she said, and she wasn't talking to anyone specific. "Pulse ox is dropping," the circulating nurse said. 81. "Okay, bag him." She looked at the airway. "Do not let that number go below 75. If it hits 75, I'm on it." Reese had taken the bag from the respiratory tech and positioned herself. Whatever her feelings about how this situation had developed, her hands knew what to do when it mattered. The room found a rhythm. Not a comfortable rhythm, not a smooth one. People got in each other's way twice. Someone knocked over a tray that clattered against the floor and made everyone's heart rate spike. Tara handed Emily the wrong gauge needle, and Emily caught it and just shook her head and held out her hand for the right one without comment. Real, messy, high-stakes medicine in a room where the protocols hadn't been designed for this specific nightmare. But it was working. Slowly, and with several moments where it very much did not look like it was going to, it was working. The pulse ox climbed. 78, 82, 87. The rhythm on the monitor stopped doing the ugly thing and started doing something that, while not normal, was at least the kind of abnormal you could manage. Emily exhaled once, quietly, through her nose, and kept working. In the corridor outside the OR, she would learn later, Hospital Director Richard Holloway had arrived. He was a man in his late 50s who had built his career on institutional relationships and risk management, and he had received a call from someone on the administrative floor about an Army general physically entering his operating room, and he had come down personally to manage the situation. He stood in the corridor with Mercer's chief resident and the head of nursing services, and two people from the legal department who had materialized with the specific speed that legal departments demonstrate whenever they think liability is occurring. Nobody went through the door. Wolf's escorts were not blocking it. They were simply standing near it. That was sufficient. 40 minutes after Emily first pushed the atropine, the soldier's rhythm stabilized enough to move him to a monitored bed in the surgical ICU. Not out of danger, she was honest about that. She was not the kind of person who called things before they were called, but stable in the sense that the immediate catastrophic failure had been interrupted. The compound was still in his system. The reversal agents needed time, but the flat line was off the screen and his color was better. And when she pressed her fingers to his wrist, the pulse was there, and it was real. She stood at the bedside and let herself feel it for exactly 5 seconds. Then she stripped her gloves and looked up and found General Wolf watching her from the doorway of the SICU bay. "What's his prognosis?" he asked. "He needs full toxicology monitoring for the next 24 to 48 hours. The pralidoxime may or may not have caught him in time. There's a reactivation window, and I don't know if we were inside it. He'll need repeat atropine dosing on a schedule, and I'd want to see a specialist from the Chemical Casualty Care Division if you can get one here." She paused. "But he's alive." "He shouldn't be, and he is." Wolf nodded slowly. He looked at the soldier. Sergeant First Class. If the rank insignia on the torn uniform bag beside the bed was accurate, and his expression was not soft exactly, but it was something. "Sergeant Dalton has been with my unit for 9 years. Emily didn't have an answer for that. She just acknowledged it. "How did you know?" he asked. "The compound. I was a combat medic, 2 deployments. We had 3 casualties from a prototype device in Helmand in 2019, classified incident. I know the incident." That stopped her. She looked at him. "I signed the report," he said simply. The corridor outside the SICU bay was not quiet. It had been getting progressively less quiet for the past 20 minutes, and when Emily stepped out, she understood why. Holloway was there. She recognized him from the hospital's endless chain of all-staff emails and the framed photo in the lobby. And beside him was Mercer, who had changed out of his surgical gown and was now in his white coat with his arms still crossed and his expression arranged into something that had moved past fury and was now performing aggrievement. Holloway spoke first, to Wolf rather than to Emily, which told her everything she needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. General, I appreciate the urgency of the situation, but what occurred in that operating room was a serious breach of our institutional protocols. A non-physician administered controlled medications without a physician order, which, regardless of the outcome, she had a verbal directive from a 4-star general under emergency military jurisdiction, Wolf said. That's not a legal framework that applies to a civilian. Mr. Holloway. Wolf looked at him with the particular weariness of a man who has spent 30-odd years dealing with people who prioritize process over outcome in situations that do not have time for process. A special operations soldier who is alive in that room would be dead right now if we'd waited for your protocols. I'd like you to think carefully about what argument you want to make to me this morning. Holloway absorbed that. Something moved behind his eyes. The calculation Emily had seen before in people who run institutions, the rapid assessment of political terrain, of what this looked like, and what it would cost. He glanced at the legal team flanking him. Mercer, who apparently had decided that the general's warning did not apply to him, stepped forward. She violated chain of command. She disrupted a surgical procedure. And the fact that the patient didn't die does not retroactively justify Nathan. Holloway's voice had an edge. Insubordination from a floor nurse who decided that her 2 years of Army field experience qualified her to override a board-certified trauma surgeon. Emily looked at him. She had been keeping very quiet, because quiet was right, because this was not the moment for her to speak. But she looked at him, and she let him see that she was looking, and she didn't look away, and something in that apparently bothered him more than if she'd argued back. I want her terminated, Mercer said, still looking at Holloway, not at her. Today. I want documentation of the protocol violations, and I want it on record that she was removed from this floor under Dr. Mercer. Wolf's voice. Mercer stopped. I suggest you stop talking, Wolf said, right now, while you still have the option of doing it voluntarily. The hallway went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Holloway was looking at Mercer with an expression that had shifted from measured to something close to alarm. Mercer seemed to register that he had miscalculated something about this situation, but wasn't sure what. His jaw worked. My legal team, he started. You'll want them, Wolf agreed, but not for the reason you think. He looked at one of his escorts and gave a small nod that Emily didn't know the meaning of, but which sent the escort stepping away down the corridor with a phone already in his hand. Emily stood in the middle of all of it and felt the ground shifting under her feet in a way that was neither comfortable nor entirely unwelcome. She was not naive enough to think this was over. She'd been in enough situations, combat, institutional, personal, to know that the moment after a crisis doesn't resolve cleanly. People who'd been wrong didn't line up to say so. People who'd tried to protect themselves from liability didn't suddenly stop protecting themselves. The calls were already being made, the positions already being established, and whatever Wolf's nod had set in motion, it would take time she didn't control. She went back to the SICU bay. Sergeant Dalton was unconscious, which was correct and expected, and his monitor was doing what she needed it to do, and the nurse who had taken over his bedside care, a solid, no-nonsense woman named Greer, who'd been on this ward 6 years, nodded at Emily with something that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite respect, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Emily pulled a chair to the corner of the bay and sat down for the first time in 4 hours. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that without judgment, adrenaline clearance. It happened every time. In Kandahar it happened. In the forward base, in Helmand, it happened. The body did the work and then it sent the invoice after. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs until they steadied. Through the glass of the SICU bay, she could still see the hallway. Holloway and Mercer had moved further down the corridor, heads together, the legal team clustered close. Whatever they were saying it quietly, and they were saying it fast. Then her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 2 words. Check email. She looked up. The corridor was the same. Same people. Same quiet crisis. She opened her hospital email on her phone. The message at the top had arrived 43 minutes ago, while she'd been in the SICU, while Dalton's heart was still trying to decide what it was going to do. It was from the Office of the Hospital Director. The subject line read, Notice of Suspension Pending Termination Review. Emily M. Brooks, RN. The message was dated and time-stamped and fully formatted with the legal department's letterhead. Mercer had filed the complaint before Dalton's heart had stabilized, before she'd even come out of the OR. He had called it in while she was standing at the bedside making sure a man didn't die, and someone in Holloway's office had drafted the paperwork and sent it while the atropine was still running. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and looked through the glass at the hallway where Holloway and Mercer were still talking. Then she looked at the monitor above Dalton's bed, the steady, imperfect, real heartbeat of a man who was alive because she had refused to leave, and she breathed through it. Across the SICU, she became aware of a presence she hadn't registered before. A man in civilian clothes, sitting very still in the far corner, a tablet in his lap, and a badge clipped to his breast pocket that was not a hospital badge. She hadn't seen him come in. She wasn't sure how long he'd been there. He was looking at her. Not the way the legal team looked at her. Not the way Mercer looked at her. He was looking at her the way people look at someone they have been sent to find. He held up the badge briefly so she could read it. Department of Defense, Criminal Investigative Division. Her stomach tightened. He stood up, crossed the SYCU, and stopped 3 feet from her chair. Nurse Brooks, he said quietly. My name is Garrett Osei. I've been on site since 0600 this morning. We were already here when the transport came in. He paused. We need to talk about what Dr. Mercer knew before that patient arrived. Emily looked at the badge for a second longer than she needed to because her brain was still running 2 tracks simultaneously, Dalton's monitor, the suspension email, and adding a third required a conscious effort. What do you mean, what he knew before? She said. Not a question. The shape of a question without the uncertainty. Osei sat down in the chair beside hers without being invited, which told her something about how he operated. He set the tablet face down on his knee. How much do you know about the DoD contract this hospital holds? I know it exists. I know it covers the military trauma unit. I don't know the specifics. The contract was renegotiated 14 months ago. Dr. Mercer was the hospital's primary signatory on the medical services side. He paused. The renegotiation included a classified addendum covering treatment protocols for casualties involving non-standard munitions, specifically the class of thermobaric devices your patient was exposed to this morning. She processed that. So Mercer had access to the protocol. He had mandatory access. He was required to review it as part of contract compliance. He signed the acknowledgement form. Osei let that sit. Which means when that transport came in this morning, and your patient presented with the exact symptom cluster described in the addendum he signed, he knew. The words came out flat. Or he should have. Those aren't the same thing legally, but either way, yes. Osei looked at the glass, at the hallway beyond. We've been watching this hospital for 6 weeks, not Mercer specifically, the contract compliance overall, but this morning moved things considerably faster than we anticipated. Emily looked at her phone. The suspension email was still there. She turned the screen off. They've already filed to terminate me. I know. I saw it come through. You've been in the system? We have access to hospital communications under the contract's oversight clause. He said it without apology. Nurse Brooks, I need you to understand something. What happened in that OR this morning is going to become a formal investigation. There are people in this building who are aware of that and are currently deciding how aggressively to get ahead of it. He looked at her directly. You are not the target of this investigation, but the people who are the target are going to try to make you look like one. Down the hall, Mercer had separated from Holloway. He was on his phone, walking toward the elevator with his back to the SICU. The legal team was still with Holloway. 3 of them bent over a tablet that one of them was holding, scrolling through something. Emily watched them. How long do I have before Holloway acts on that suspension? Formally, 48 hours for a written response under hospital HR policy. Practically, Osei tilted his head. He'll want it done before the end of business today. Less time for it to look like a reaction to us being here. And if I'm suspended, I can't be in this unit. Correct. She looked at Dalton's monitor, steady, the atropine drip running at the rate she'd set. Greer was at the bedside doing vitals and charting, professional and unhurried, and she glanced up once, caught Emily's eye through the glass, and looked back down at her chart. "What do you need from me?" Emily asked. Osei reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, actual paper, which felt deliberately anachronistic. A formal statement. Your clinical observations in sequence, starting from patient arrival. Everything you saw, everything you administered, everything that was said. I need it in your words before anyone coaches you on what your words should be. You think someone's going to try to coach me. I think someone already tried to remove you from this building, and that when that didn't work out the way they planned, they filed a termination notice in under 40 minutes. So yes. She took the document, looked at the header. Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense. Below it, in smaller type. Witness statement. Medical incident. Classified compound exposure. Blackstone Military Medical Center. Her name was already typed in the designated line. They'd prepared this before talking to her. She looked up at Osei. You were going to find me regardless of how this morning went. Yes, he said, simply. She uncapped the pen he offered and started writing. The statement took 40 minutes. She was thorough. She was not someone who padded language or softened edges in documentation, which was a habit from the Army where the difference between an accurate after-action report and a diplomatic one could cost someone their career or their life. She wrote what she observed, what she assessed, what she said, what was said to her, what she administered and when, in what sequence, with what result. She wrote it without editorializing and without self-justification, and when she was done, the document was 6 pages and every sentence was load-bearing. Osei read it once, quickly. Then he looked up. You documented the interaction with the paramedics. I documented everything. You noted that they confirmed classified mission parameters at patient intake. They confirmed there was a secondary dispersal layer. Yes. He nodded slowly in a way that suggested this confirmed something he'd already known, but was glad to have in writing. He folded the document, placed it inside the tablet case. I'm going to ask you to stay in this unit for now. Don't go to the administrative floor. Don't respond to the email. And if security comes for me? Osei stood, straightened his jacket. They won't. He said it with the same quiet certainty that Wolf had used all morning, and she was beginning to understand that this variety of certainty, not arrogance, not performance, but the flat declarative confidence of someone who knew the board 2 moves further than the other players, was something she was going to have to navigate carefully. These men were on her side this morning. That was contingent, and she knew it. She went back to Dalton's bedside. His color had improved again, incremental but real. The modeling at the wound margin had faded from the purple-red of active toxin effect to a dull brownish pink that said the reversal agents were doing something useful. He was still unconscious, which was right. His body was doing the most important work of his life right now, and consciousness would only interfere with it. His BP had climbed to a range she could tolerate. His pulse ox sat at 93 and held there. He's fighting, Greer said, without looking up from the chart. Yeah. Emily checked the atropine drip. He is. Greer was quiet for a moment, then, what you did in there? Don't. I'm not going to make it a thing. She stopped, seemed to decide something. 6 years on this ward. I've never seen anyone do that. Emily looked at the monitor. I've never wanted to have to. She stayed at Dalton's bedside for the better part of an hour, adjusting the protocol in small increments as his response developed, communicating with the ward pharmacist about the repeat dosing schedule, fielding 2 calls from the SICU attending physician, Dr. Margot Fenn, who had the grace to engage with Emily's clinical observations as if they were worth engaging with, which was the first time today that had happened from someone with an MD after their name. Fenn arrived in person at 9:40. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen enough crises to have stopped performing urgency years ago. She reviewed Dalton's chart, reviewed Emily's documentation, asked 4 specific questions about the reversal protocol, and then said, "This is solid work," in a tone that was not effusive and was therefore worth something. "He's not stable yet," Emily said. "No, but the curve is pointing the right direction." Fenn looked at the chart again. "I'm taking over as attending of record. I want to make that formal before end of hour." Emily understood what that meant. With Fenn as attending of record, the clinical decisions had a physician's signature behind them. It protected Dalton medically. It also, not incidentally, put a licensed physician's name on the treatment that Emily had initiated, which created a cleaner institutional record than a nurse acting unilaterally under a general's verbal directive. "Thank you," Emily said. "Don't thank me. You built the protocol. I'm just signing it." Fenn looked at her sideways. "You should know that Nathan Mercer has been on the phone with the hospital's legal counsel for the past hour. I don't know what he's saying, but I know Nathan, and I know that when he's wrong about something, he burns a lot of energy trying to make the record say he wasn't. I've gotten that impression. Watch your back today. Not because you did anything wrong, because that doesn't always matter in buildings like this one." Fenn capped her pen. "I'll be back in 2 hours." She left, and Emily stood in the quiet of the SICU bay, and the adrenaline that had been holding her upright since 7:14 began its slow, inevitable descent. Her lower back had started to ache. She'd been on her feet for 3 hours without sitting except for the statement. She was hungry in the distant, academic way that bodies register hunger when the brain has temporarily suspended all non-essential functions. She was thinking about Fenn's words, "before end of hour," when the sound reached her. Not loud. A commotion is rarely loud at its start. It begins as the wrong kind of foot traffic, voices at a register that carries without the words being clear, doors opening in a sequence that doesn't fit the rhythm of a normal floor. She registered it the way she'd learned to register things in forward positions. Not panic, just attention, the slow, deliberate rotation of focus toward the anomaly. She stepped to the SICU bay door and looked into the corridor. Mercer was back. He was not alone. He had 2 security personnel with him. Not the guards from this morning, different ones, bigger, from the private contracted security firm the hospital used rather than the in-house team. And beside them was a woman Emily didn't recognize in a charcoal blazer with a Blackstone administrative ID on a lanyard. HR, by the look of it. The kind of HR that gets sent to do things the floor supervisors don't want to do. They were walking toward the SICU with a purpose that did not suggest they were there to check on Sergeant Dalton. Emily didn't move. Mercer saw her through the glass and his stride didn't change, but something in his face did. A tightening, an anticipation, and she understood in that moment that this was the move Holloway had decided to make. Not wait, not file paperwork and let it process. Do it now, while the DoD investigator's presence was still being assessed, before anything was formalized, before the morning's events hardened into a record that was difficult to contest. Get her out of the building. The HR woman arrived first. She had a manila envelope in one hand that she held like a serving tray, flat, offered. "Ms. Brooks, I'm Karen Vela, Human Resources. I'm here to inform you that effective immediately, you are suspended with pay pending a formal review of this morning's clinical incidents. I'll need your hospital ID badge and your access card, and security will escort you to the exit." Emily looked at the envelope, then at Vela, then at Mercer, who was standing 2 steps back with his arms at his sides and an expression that was attempting neutral and landing somewhere closer to satisfied. "I'm in the middle of monitoring a patient," Emily said. "Dr. Fenn has assumed attending responsibilities. The patient's care will not be interrupted." Vela held the envelope a fraction of an inch closer. "Your badge, please." "The patient's atropine protocol needs to be adjusted in," Emily checked her watch, "43 minutes. I need to communicate that to Greer before I go anywhere." "I can give you 5 minutes to—" "I don't need your 5 minutes." She turned and walked back into the bay and went directly to Greer, and she talked for 4 minutes straight, specific and fast, The dosing schedule and the indicators to watch and the thresholds for calling Fen and the signs that would mean the reversal wasn't holding. Greer wrote it down. All of it. Without being asked, she wrote every word. When Emily came back to the door, Mercer was watching her with an expression she couldn't read and didn't have time to analyze. She unclipped her badge. She held it in her hand for a moment. 14 months of her name on this floor. 142 shifts. More than that if you counted the overtime. She handed it to Vela. The escort to the elevator was not dignified, but she'd expected that. And she kept her head level and her face neutral, and she did not look at the nurse's station where Tara was standing very still watching it happen, or at the door of the SICU bay, or at Mercer. She looked at the elevator. They rode down in silence. The security team, to their credit, were doing their job without editorializing, which she respected even under these circumstances. The lobby was busy. Visiting hours had started. The coffee concession was running. 2 families were at the reception desk. The world continuing at its normal speed while hers had stopped and reoriented. Outside. The morning had warmed while she'd been inside. October in Redwood Falls meant the sun had some actual intention to it by mid-morning, and it hit her face, and she stood on the hospital steps for a moment and breathed. Her car was in the employee lot. She had her keys, her phone, her wallet. She had her 6-page witness statement in a DOD evidence file inside the building. She had the clothes on her back and a suspension notice in an email and the knowledge sitting in her chest like a stone that Sergeant Dalton's atropine window in 43 minutes was now 39 minutes, and she wasn't going to be there for it. She trusted Greer. She did. But trust was a different thing than being there yourself, and she had learned that distinction in places where the cost of the difference was irreversible. She walked to her car, sat in the driver's seat, did not start the engine. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Miss Brooks? A voice she didn't recognize. Male, measured, accent she couldn't place precisely, something mid-Atlantic. My name is Colonel Dale Prescott. I'm with the Chemical Casualty Care Division out of Aberdeen. Agent Osei asked me to reach you directly. A pause. I've been reviewing the exposure data from your patient's case. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your field experience with the Hellman incident in 2019. She went still. How do you know about Hellman? Because I wrote the classified protocol that your hospital's chief surgeon was required to read and didn't follow. His voice was still measured, still quiet. But underneath the measured quality, there was something that moved like anger in deep water. Controlled, pressurized, going somewhere. Ms. Brooks, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because it changes the scope of what you're involved in significantly. She looked at the hospital entrance through her windshield, the automatic doors, the families going in and out. I'm listening, she said. The compound Sergeant Dalton was exposed to was field deployed for the first time this morning. We have been tracking its development for 11 months through a joint DoD intelligence operation. He paused again, shorter this time, deliberate. We believe this hospital was selected as the receiving facility not at random, but because someone with access to both the classified protocol and the transport routing made a specific choice to send a nerve agent casualty to a surgeon they knew would mismanage the case. The sentence arranged itself in her mind. Not negligence, not arrogance, not a bad day, a choice. You're saying Mercer was supposed to... She stopped, reconstructed. You're saying Dalton was supposed to die here. We're saying it's a line of inquiry we can no longer rule out, Prescott said carefully. And we're saying that you, by refusing to be removed from that room, interrupted something that was very carefully arranged. Another pause. Which is why, Ms. Brooks, you need to get back in that building right now, not through the front entrance. There's a loading dock entrance on the east side of the building. Osei will meet you there in 6 minutes. I've been suspended. They took my badge. We're aware. Something shifted in his voice, not warmer exactly, but closer to something. You won't need it. She looked at her phone, at the time, at the hospital. 36 minutes to Dalton's next atropine window. She got out of the car. The loading dock entrance was exactly where Prescott had said, east side, past the parking structure, down a short service ramp that smelled of industrial cleaner and kitchen exhaust. Osei was there when she arrived, and with him was a man she hadn't seen before in Army service dress, the kind of dress that indicated this was official and intentional rather than incidental. He had a colonel's insignia and the particular posture of someone who had been awake for significantly longer than his affect suggested. "Nurse Brooks," he offered a hand. "Colonel Vance Theriault. I'm the legal officer attached to General Wolfe's command. I have some paperwork I need you to look at." She looked at Osei. "Is this—" "It's real," Osei said. "Look at it." Theriault handed her a document. It was brief, a single page, dense with formal language, but the operative sentences were in the second paragraph and they were not ambiguous. Under the authority of the Department of Defense Civilian Emergency Medical Specialist Provision, and in light of the ongoing classified investigation designated Operation File Number Redacted, Emily M. Brooks, RN, was hereby designated a civilian emergency medical specialist temporarily attached to General Wolfe's command, with full hospital access privileges reinstated for the duration of the investigation. It had Wolfe's signature at the bottom. She read it twice. "Is this legal?" "It's a provision that's been on the books since 2003 and used exactly 4 times, Theriault said. "It is unambiguously legal. It supersedes the hospital's suspension. Holloway is going to— Holloway has been notified." Something in Theriault's expression. "He's not happy. He's also not in a position to contest a DoD emergency designation without triggering a full federal audit of the hospital's contract compliance, which, given what we're finding in the contract records, he would not survive." They went in through the loading dock, a service elevator, then a back corridor she'd used once before when they were moving equipment during a renovation. The SICU was 2 floors up, and she moved through the building with the 2 men behind her and didn't slow down for anything. Greer looked up when she pushed through the SICU door. Whatever crossed Greer's face in that moment, relief, confusion, something that was both, she compressed into a single nod. 31 minutes, Greer said. "I know." Emily was already at the chart. "Walk me through what's changed." What had changed was mostly good. The pulse ox had held at 94, the BP had ticked up 2 points, the rhythm had not thrown anything alarming in the hour she'd been gone. The bad was smaller, but real. One of Dalton's pupils was slightly more responsive than the other, which could be residual toxin effect or could be the beginning of something neurological, and she needed to flag it for Fen. She called Fen. Fen answered on the second ring, which she'd noticed was a pattern with that woman. She described the pupil discrepancy, heard Fen's thinking through the phone, and they landed on a decision together in about 90 seconds. Hold the current protocol, add a neurocheck every 15 minutes, and if the discrepancy widened, get CT imaging immediately. "You're back," Fen said. "DoD designation. It's in the system." A beat. "Good," Fen said, and hung up. At the nurse's station outside the SICU, something was happening. Emily became aware of it gradually. Raised voices, not shouting, but not conversation either, coming from the direction of the corridor that led to the administrative elevator bank. She looked through the SICU glass. Theriault was out there, and Osei, and there was a third man she now recognized as one of Wolfe's armed escorts from this morning. Mercer was in the corridor. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. Mercer's body language was the eloquent part. The rigidity that had started this morning as authority and was now something different. Something that looked from this distance like a man discovering that the ground he'd been standing on had reclassified itself as air. His hands moved twice. Theriault said something. Mercer said something back. Theriault opened a folder he was carrying and held it out. Mercer looked at whatever was in the folder. He didn't take it. He stood there and looked at it, and something happened to his face that Emily watched through the glass and felt, despite everything, was not entirely satisfying. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because whatever she'd expected the moment of Mercer understanding to look like, it didn't look like anything clean. It looked like a middle-aged man in a white coat standing in a hospital corridor, realizing the story he'd been telling himself about this morning was not the story the rest of the world had been watching. She looked away. Back to Dalton. Back to the chart. 26 minutes. She was rechecking the atropine drip when Wolfe appeared in the SICU doorway. He had changed out of his dress uniform into something more functional. service uniform, no ceremony to it, and he looked, for the first time this morning, like he was tired. Not incapacitated. Tired in the way of a man who had been awake since well before any of them, and who was managing that fact with long practice. "How is he?" Wolf asked. "Improving, slowly. I'd feel better after the 24-hour mark." Wolf stepped inside the bay. He looked at Dalton in the bed, the still face, the monitors, the lines, and was quiet for a moment. "His wife is downstairs. She was told he was in surgery. Nobody's updated her." Emily looked up. "That needs to happen." "I know. Fenn's handling it." He paused. "I want you to know something. What Prescott told you on the phone, the line of inquiry about this case being arranged, that is not confirmed. It is a theory with evidence behind it, and we are pursuing it, but I don't want you carrying it as a certainty because it's not one yet." She appreciated that, the precision of it. "Understood. What I can tell you is that the toxicology sample we pulled from the transport vehicle has been expedited to the Aberdeen lab. We'll have preliminary compound identification within 6 hours. He looked at the monitor. "And that what you did this morning, the way you held your clinical position under pressure, and then executed when you were given the chance, that's not something I'm going to forget." She didn't know what to do with that, so she just nodded. He left. She stayed. 22 minutes to the atropine window. She ran the next check, vitals, pupils, rhythm, and logged everything with the precision she used for everything and kept her hands moving because that was always the right answer when the alternative was thinking too hard about what Prescott had said on the phone. Not random. Selected. The compound deployed for the first time, the facility chosen, the surgeon who had signed the protocol. She was building a picture in her mind the way you build pictures from pieces, not forcing connection, just placing the pieces where they fell and looking at the shape that was emerging. Mercer had the classified protocol. Mercer had the contract relationship. Mercer had the authority to override any clinical recommendation from any person below him on the hospital hierarchy, which was everyone. If someone had wanted a nerve agent casualty to die cleanly in a trauma bay that had a legitimate military contract and a plausible chain of medical events, the gunshot wound, the surgery, the surgical complication, the death on the table, Blackstone Military Medical Center was not a bad choice, and an arrogant chief surgeon who didn't listen to nurses was not a bad instrument. She pressed her palms flat on the bedside rail and looked at the ceiling and thought about Marcus, who had died on the wrong coordinates, and about the 3 men in Helmand, and about how many times she had stood in the specific location she was standing in right now, not geographically, but situationally, at the intersection of what she knew and what the people with authority refused to hear, and how every single time the cost of that gap had been measured in the worst currency there was. Her phone buzzed. "Oh, say, Mercer's access has been suspended pending investigation. He's been asked to leave the building." She exhaled. Then a second message, 10 seconds later from the same number. "Lab called. Preliminary ID on the compound came back early. It's not in any database. DOD says it's new. Classified above TS/SCI. Only 6 people in the country were supposed to know it existed." She stared at the message. Mercer's name is on that list. And across the SICU, through the glass, she saw Terriol in the corridor stop walking. Stop very suddenly. His phone was at his ear and his face had gone completely, deliberately still. The face of someone receiving information that required all available resources to process. And he turned slowly until he was facing the SYCU bay. Facing her. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned and walked very fast in the direction of the administrative wing, and even from here, through the glass, she could see he was already dialing a second number before the first call had ended. Terriol was moving fast enough that 2 nurses in the corridor had to step aside. Emily watched him disappear around the corner toward the administrative wing and felt the specific weight of information settling into place. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in the way that complex things clarify when the last piece lands. 6 people in the country, classified above TS/SCI, Mercer's name on the list. That wasn't incompetence, that was something else entirely, and it had a different name. And the name carried consequences that dwarfed a suspension notice or a contract dispute or even a soldier on a SICU monitor. She checked the time. 14 minutes to the atropine window. She went back to work because work was the only correct response to the particular vertigo of understanding something you couldn't yet do anything about. She ran the vitals check, logged the numbers, noted that the pupil discrepancy from 20 minutes ago had marginally reduced. A good sign, not a definitive one, but the direction was right. And she updated the chart with the kind of documentation precision that had always been her default when everything else was unstable. Concrete things, measurable things, numbers that didn't have agendas. Greer came to stand beside her without comment, and for a few minutes they worked in the quiet that develops between two people who understand the same situation and don't need to perform understanding for each other. "You know what he was doing before he got on that transport?" Greer asked eventually, her voice low, not looking up from the line she was checking. "No." His teammate told me, while they were waiting in the corridor. He said Dalton had just re-enlisted. 3rd time. His daughter was born 6 weeks ago. She paused. He named her Ellie. Emily looked at Dalton's face. Still unconscious, the steady manufactured calm of monitored sleep. He looked younger than his rank suggested. Most of them did, up close, when you got past the specifics of what they did for a living. "All right," she said, and didn't say anything else, and administered the atropine at the correct time with the correct dose, and recorded it and moved on. Osei came back to the SICU at 11:40. He had the controlled affect of someone who had spent the last hour in rooms she hadn't been in, hearing things she hadn't heard, and was now managing the calibration between what he could say and what he needed her to understand. "We need to move you," he said. "Dalton's not stable enough for me to— not out of the hospital, out of this unit. There's a conference room on 4 that's been designated as the investigative coordination point. Wolf wants you there." He paused. "Fen will cover the SICU." She looked at the bay, at Dalton, at the monitor that had become, over the past 4 hours, a kind of constant in a morning full of variables. 20-minute check on the atropine drip, she told Greer. "If his pulse ox drops below 90, call Fen immediately. Don't wait for the scheduled check. And the pupil discrepancy." "I've got it!" Greer's voice was firm, not impatient. "Go!" The conference room on 4 was not a room Emily had ever been in. It was the kind of space that existed in hospital administrative buildings in a state of permanent underuse. A long table, chairs that didn't quite match, a whiteboard with the ghost of some previous meeting's markers still faintly visible behind the cleaning. In the past hour, it had been transformed into something that bore no resemblance to its normal purpose. Terriolt's people had set up 2 laptops and a secure communication terminal that had not come from Blackstone's inventory. There were printed documents on the table in organized stacks, each stack separated by color-coded folders. A woman Emily hadn't met was on a phone call in the corner, her voice too low to decode. Wolf was at the head of the table. Terriolt was to his left. Osei took a seat near the door. Wolf looked at Emily when she entered. "Sit down." She sat. He didn't build to it. That, she'd learned in 4 hours, was how he operated. The shortest line between what he knew and what he needed the other person to know. "The Aberdeen lab has completed preliminary compound analysis. The substance Sergeant Dalton was exposed to is a modified organophosphate variant that has never been used in a field deployment before this morning. Its development pathway has been tracked by the Chemical Casualty Care Division for 14 months. It originated from research conducted within a joint defense contractor program." He looked at the table, then at her. "The contractor with primary access to the compound's development data is Veritas Meridian Group. Veritas Meridian's civilian medical liaison, the person responsible for communicating protocol updates to contracted hospital partners, is Dr. Nathan Mercer." She absorbed it. "He wasn't just on the list because of the hospital contract," she said. "No, he was on the list because he was a paid consultant to the program." Terriolt opened a folder and slid it across the table toward her. 18 months of quarterly payments from Veritas Meridian's research division. Not disclosed to the hospital, not disclosed to the DoD Contract Compliance Office, not disclosed on his conflict of interest forms. She looked at the documents. Financial records, neatly tabulated, numbers that represented Mercer's calculation of what he was worth and what certain outcomes were worth, and where those two things had intersected in a way that cost a man named Dalton a daughter he might not get to watch grow up. Why? She looked up. What does Veritas gain from Dalton dying in this hospital? Wolf and Theriault exchanged a look that lasted about 1 second and communicated something she wasn't entirely party to. Then Wolf said, Dalton's unit was extracting evidence from a site in the operational area. Evidence that directly implicates Veritas Meridian in unauthorized field testing of the compound on a prior deployment. Dalton had the documentation on him. The classified mission. Yes. So he needed to not arrive. He needed to not survive the arrival, Theriault said. The gunshot wound was legitimate, enemy contact during extraction, but the compound exposure was not accidental. The device used at the site was Veritas Meridian hardware, and someone ensured that the medical facility designated to receive him was staffed with a surgeon who would follow a protocol guaranteed to accelerate rather than treat the exposure. The room was very quiet, except for the woman in the corner, still on her phone, her voice a low, continuous murmur. Emily looked at the financial records again. Quarterly payments. 18 months. She thought about this morning. The speed of Mercer's dismissal, the precision of his certainty, the way he'd moved to neutralize her before the patient had even been on the table for 2 minutes. It hadn't felt like a surgeon protecting his authority. It had felt like a man protecting a plan. Where's Mercer now? Building security escorted him off premises at 10:15, Osei said. We have federal agents at his residence, and his vehicle is being tracked. He hasn't left Redwood Falls. And Holloway? Holloway is a separate problem. Theriault stacked the folders with the particular controlled care of someone managing their own frustration. Holloway didn't know about Veritas Meridian. Our assessment is that he was kept deliberately ignorant, useful for exactly the function he served this morning, which was institutional cover. He tried to get you out of the building because he thought he was managing a liability problem. He was actually managing someone else's crime without knowing it. He paused. That doesn't absolve him. It changes his exposure category. He still tried to have me fired for saving a man's life. Yes. Theriault's expression was not unsympathetic. That will be part of the record. Wolf leaned forward slightly. Emily, I need to ask you something directly. The documentation from Dalton's mission, the evidence his unit was extracting, we believe he may have had physical copies, not just digital. When he arrived this morning, his gear was bagged and tagged at intake. Do you know where that intake bag is? She thought back. The paramedics at intake. The rush to the trauma bay. Standard procedure was to bag personal effects and secure them with patient belongings in the designated lockup on the trauma floor, 1 floor below where they currently sat. Trauma floor intake lockup, she said. Room 114. There's a combination and a key system. The combination changes daily and it's held by the charge nurse. Who is the charge nurse on trauma today? She thought. Sandra Obi. She came on at 7. Wolf looked at Theriault, who was already on his phone. She watched Theriault move to the corner and speak quietly, and she ran the thread forward in her mind. If the evidence Dalton's unit extracted was in that bag, and Mercer had known it was coming, then the intake lockup on the trauma floor was a known quantity. Anyone with enough hospital access and foreknowledge of the intake process could. How long has Mercer had his hospital access suspended? She asked. Osei checked his phone. Access was flagged at 10:22. What about the people who work for him, his residents, his OR team? A silence. Osei looked at Wolf. Wolf looked at Theriault's back, still on the phone. That's a gap, Osei said, and his voice had a quality it hadn't had before. Theriault turned from the corner. Sandra Obi isn't answering the charge nurse station. Emily was already standing. They moved fast, not running, because running in a hospital corridor was its own kind of alarm, but with the compressed efficiency of people who had stopped deliberating. Osei went first, then Emily, then one of Wolf's escorts who had materialized from somewhere near the conference room door. Theriault stayed back, still on the phone, his voice now carrying a sharpness that cut through his professional register. The elevator took too long. They took the stairs. Trauma floor. The corridor was normal, busy with the ordinary traffic of mid-morning, nurses and techs, and a dietary cart and a family walking slowly in the direction of a patient room. Room 114 was at the far end, past the nurses' station, past the supply alcove, set into the wall behind a door that looked like a utility closet because it had been designed to look like a utility closet. The door was open, not wide open, a few inches, the way a door is when someone is left in a hurry and didn't pull it fully closed behind them. Osei held out his arm to stop Emily, which she understood, and he moved ahead to the door and pushed it open with his shoulder, and she could see past him into the small room. Shelves, labeled bags, the intake system, a small desk with a tablet mounted above it. Sandra Obi was seated in the chair at the desk. She was conscious, her hands in her lap, her face the particular controlled blankness of someone who has been frightened recently and is managing the aftermath of it. There was a red mark on her right wrist that was going to develop into a bruise. Across the room, on the shelf where Dalton's intake bag should have been, there was a gap between two other bags that was exactly the right size. "Ms. Obi." Osei's voice was professional, careful, no urgency in the sound of it, even though all of it was in the air. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice was steady with effort. "He pushed past me. I called out and he—" She looked at her wrist. "He took the bag." "Who?" She looked up. Her eyes went to Emily first, then to Osei. "Dr. Mercer's resident, Dr. Kyle Sutter." Emily knew Sutter. Not well. He'd been on the trauma floor for 6 months, one of Mercer's second years, quiet, competent in the way that residents who attach themselves to powerful attendings learn to be competent. He had been in the corridor this morning when she'd been escorted off the floor. She could picture his face, watching, saying nothing, positioned behind Mercer with the particular careful stillness of someone who understood which side they were on. Osei was already on his radio. She heard him give a description, a direction. South stairwell, 5 minutes ago, male, second-year resident, carrying a patient intake bag. And the response came back fast enough that she understood people had been pre-positioned in this building at various points she hadn't known about. She looked at Sandra. "Are you sure you're not hurt?" "I'm sure." Sandra looked at her wrist again. "He didn't mean to. I don't think he—" She stopped. "He looked scared, like he hadn't expected me to be here." "Was the room locked when he got here?" "Yes. He had a code." Sandra looked at the door. "He had our daily code. Mercer's residents would have access through their attending. Not formally. Codes were issued to authorized personnel only. But the informal architecture of how a trauma floor actually operated meant that Mercer's team, Mercer's daily codes, Mercer's systems, were all adjacent to each other in ways that a determined person could navigate if they'd had 8 months to observe them. The radio on Osei's belt crackled. A voice, controlled, reporting. Dr. Kyle Sutter had been located in the parking structure on level 2. He was not running. He was sitting in his car with the intake bag on the passenger seat and his hands on the steering wheel, and by the field agent's description, the expression of someone who had just realized that the thing he'd been asked to do and the thing he was willing to actually do had turned out to be 2 different things. He had not left the building. The bag was intact. Emily exhaled slowly. Sandra was accepting a bottle of water from a nurse who had appeared, and the sound of the corridor was normalizing around them, and she stood in the doorway of room 114 and felt the shape of the morning rearranging itself again. Not resolved, not finished, but pivoting in a direction that was at least the right one. Osei came to stand beside her. Sutter gave himself up without contact. Field team says he was cooperative. "How long has he been involved?" "We don't know yet." He paused. "But he sat in that parking structure instead of leaving, which means something." She thought about that. A second-year resident, mid-20s probably, had no idea 6 months ago when he chose Mercer as his attending what he was actually choosing, or maybe he did. Or maybe he'd found out gradually, in the way that people find out gradually about the corners of the things they've attached themselves to, and had kept rationalizing until a Tuesday morning when his mentor handed him a specific task and he'd driven to level 2 of a parking structure and stopped. People were not simple. Even the ones who ended up on the wrong side of things. She went back upstairs. Not to the conference room, to the SICU. The pull of it was reflexive, and she didn't question it. Dalton's numbers were better. Not dramatically, not cinematically. This was medicine, not television. But the trend line over the past 2 hours was pointing somewhere she could live with. The pulse ox at 95. The rhythm cleaner than it had been at any point since he'd arrived. The atropine protocol holding. Greer had his notes updated to the minute, which was the mark of a nurse who took seriously the idea that continuity of documentation was continuity of care. Ben arrived at the bedside 8 minutes after Emily. She reviewed the chart in the focused, unhurried way she did everything, and then she said, "The 12-hour mark is looking viable." "He's not clear yet." "No, but I'll take viable." Ben looked at the monitor. The pralidoxime window was close. Another 20 minutes and it wouldn't have mattered. Emily knew that. She'd known it since the moment she'd first looked at Dalton's pupils in the trauma bay and understood what she was looking at. The 20-minute window was not a figure of speech. It was the pharmacological reality of the reactivation timeline, the narrow gap between intervention and the point at which the enzyme damage became irreversible. She'd been on the right side of that gap by a margin that she was only now, hours later, beginning to feel the full weight of. "His wife is here," Fenn said. She asked about the nurse who saved him. She heard from the paramedic team, apparently. Emily looked at the door. "Do you want me to—" "Not yet," Emily said, "when he's stable. When I have something to say that isn't hedged." Fenn accepted that. She checked one more line entry on the chart and then left, and Emily stood at the foot of Dalton's bed and did the things she'd been doing all morning, kept her hands moving, kept her focus on the concrete and measurable, kept the parts of herself that wanted to process the broader architecture of the day in a compartment that would get attention later when there was room for it. Her phone rang at 1:17. The number was Osei's. "We have Mercer," he said. She hadn't realized she'd been holding something in her chest until it released. "Where?" "He was at a private airfield 40 minutes outside Redwood Falls. Charter flight. He'd been booked since last week. Apparently he had a contingency in place." A pause. "Federal agents intercepted him at the gate. He's in custody. The flight was booked before this morning." "Before this morning, yes." So the whole thing had been structured with an exit, not improvised, planned. The compound, the transport routing, the surgeon, the OR protocol, the exit. 14 months of the Aberdeen lab tracking the compound's development, and all that time someone had been building the architecture of a morning that was supposed to end with a dead operator and a clean surgical record and a chartered flight waiting at a private airfield outside Redwood Falls. "What's he saying?" she asked. "Nothing. He lawyered up the second the agents made contact." Osei's voice was neutral. "That's fine. We don't need him to say anything. The financial records, the consultant agreements, the compound access logs, Sutter's statement. We have the structure without him." Another pause. "Sutter is cooperating fully. He's given us 4 hours of recorded statement. He was recruited 8 months ago. Mercer offered him a post-residency position at Veritas Meridian's Clinical Research Division. The task this morning was presented to him as securing proprietary research documentation before federal investigators could access it." A pause with weight behind it. "He says he didn't know what was in the bag." "Do you believe him?" Osei was quiet for a moment. "I believe he didn't ask. Whether that's the same thing is above my pay grade legally." Emily looked at the window. Outside, the October sun had moved, and the angle of the light through the SICU glass had shifted into the afternoon register, gold rather than white, longer shadows. The morning had become the afternoon, while she'd been living inside it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Formally? Federal charges pending review. The Veritas Meridian connection triggers a separate investigation that's going to run for months. The hospital's DOD contract is suspended pending a compliance audit." He paused. "Holloway has been asked to appear before the DOD contracting authority tomorrow morning. He's been informed that voluntary cooperation significantly affects the range of personal exposure he's facing." "And my suspension?" "Rescinded. Officially, as of 40 minutes ago. Terriol filed the reversal documentation through the hospital HR system under the DOD emergency designation. It's in your personnel file with a notation that the suspension was issued in error." A beat. "Holloway's office sent it. He didn't do it voluntarily. Terriol made clear that the alternative was a separate administrative action for retaliatory employment practice against a federal emergency designee, but it's done." She sat down. The chair at the SICU nursing station, the one she'd been in and out of all morning. Plastic, slightly too low, the kind of chair that accumulates the hours of everyone who's ever sat in it. "Okay?" she said. "Okay," Osei said, and there was something in the way he said it that was close to human. Not warmth exactly, but the recognition of a day that had been what it had been in and was now beginning to be something else. She sat for a while after the call ended. The SICU floor had the particular tempo of mid-afternoon. The shift handoff was 2 hours away, and the unit was in the settled phase of the day cycle. The acute chaos of morning resolved into the steady maintenance work of keeping people alive through the less dramatic but no less critical hours. Monitors beeped, lines were checked, charts were updated. Greer came by once, refilled a bag, glanced at Emily's face with the pragmatic assessment of a nurse who reads people the way she reads vital signs, and didn't say anything. At 2:40, Wolf came to the SYCU. He didn't come alone. Terriolt was behind him, and there was another man Emily hadn't seen before, in civilian clothes, carrying a briefcase with a federal seal embossed on the clasp. Wolf stopped at the nursing station, looked into the bay at Dalton, and then looked at Emily. "Walk with me," he said. They went to a family consultation room down the corridor. A small space with upholstered chairs and a box of tissues on a side table that had been there long enough to accumulate a fine layer of dust. The briefcase man sat, opened his case, produced a folder. "This is Agent Dwayne Ferris, FBI," Wolf said. "He's been briefed." Ferris looked at Emily with the professional appraisal of someone who had spent a career learning to read people quickly. "Nurse Brooks, I want to make sure you understand the scope of where we are. Federal charges against Nathan Mercer are being prepared as we speak. Conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of a federal investigation, unauthorized disclosure of classified program information, and a series of financial crimes tied to the Veritas Meridian relationship. These charges carry significant weight, and the evidence package supporting them is substantial." She nodded. "Your witness statement, your clinical documentation, and your actions this morning are a foundational part of that package." He paused. "I want you to know that because I want you to understand that when the defense challenges the chain of events, and they will, that's their job, your record through this morning is going to receive significant scrutiny. Your suspension, your reinstatement, the circumstances of your actions in the OR, all of it will be contested." "I know." "Your documentation was thorough," he said, and it wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an acknowledgement, which was different and more useful. "Do you have anything you want to add to your statement before we formalize it?" She thought. She thought about it seriously, running through the morning the way she ran through a shift handoff. Sequence, detail, anything that she'd noted at the time and had not fully articulated. The paramedics at intake. They confirmed the classified mission parameters. They should be interviewed. Already scheduled. Sandra Obi's wrist needs to be formally documented as an injury in the course of an obstruction act. Yes. And the atropine I had on the tray before the patient arrived. She looked at her hands. I pulled it before intake, based on observation of the transport flag and the classification marker. I want that in the record because Mercer's team will try to argue the treatment was reactive rather than informed clinical judgment. Ferris looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something in his folder. Proactive clinical assessment based on intake indicators, he said, reading it back. Pre-positioned treatment resources prior to patient contact. Yes. That's good, he said, and this time it was a compliment, and he meant it. Wolf walked Emily back to the SICU afterward, and as they passed through the corridor, she became aware that the quality of how people were looking at her had changed. Not everyone. Most people on this floor were doing their jobs and had context for exactly none of what had happened in the past 8 hours. But the nurses who'd been on since morning, the techs who'd been in the corridor, the respiratory therapist who'd been at the SICU bay entrance when the general had first walked through, she saw it in the way they didn't look away when she met their eyes. The thing that had happened on this floor today was already becoming the version of itself that people carry and retell. And in that version, the shape of what she'd done was becoming visible in a way that it hadn't been when she was doing it. She didn't know how she felt about that. She stepped back into the SICU bay and checked the monitor. Dalton's rhythm was the best it had been all day. She was writing the check into the chart when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't have saved. It took her a second to place the contact, and then she did, because the message identified itself. "This is Joel Ferrant. I was outside the trauma bay this morning. Dalton's teammate." She remembered him. The field jacket, the particular stillness, the decision he'd made to tell her about the device in the 45 seconds that had mattered more than any other 45 seconds of the day. "I heard what they did to you this morning. Before the general got there. I wanted you to know that it's been reported up the chain. All of it. From the moment you called it at intake to the moment they walked you out. The guys in my unit are going to know what you did today." She read it twice. Then she typed back, "How is he doing?" The reply came in under 30 seconds. "Better than he should be. His wife won't stop crying. Good crying." A pause, and then a second message. "He's got a daughter. She's going to grow up with a father because of you." She put the phone in her pocket, stood at the bedside, listened to the monitor doing the unremarkable, life-sustaining work of confirming that a heart was beating. Outside the SICU glass, down the corridor, she could see the door to the consultation room where Ferris and Terriolt were still working through documents. She could see Wolf standing at the corridor window with a phone at his ear, looking out at the afternoon. She could see the ordinary traffic of a hospital floor continuing around the extraordinary thing that had happened on it today. And then she saw something that stopped her. At the far end of the corridor, near the administrative elevator, Richard Holloway had emerged. He was in his suit, his face pale and composed in the specific way of a man who has spent the last 4 hours receiving information he didn't want to receive and is now arranging himself to meet whatever comes next. Beside him was a woman Emily recognized from the executive suite, his executive assistant, carrying a document binder. 2 more people were with them, neither of whom were hospital staff. They were federal agents. She could tell by the same accumulated set of signals that had let her read every other thing today. The posture, the badge visible at the hip, the way they were not quite walking beside Holloway but were oriented around him. Holloway was not being arrested. His posture wasn't that. But the 2 agents walking in his particular proximity were not there for his comfort. He passed the corridor window. He looked through the SICU glass, and his eyes found her. She didn't know if it was deliberate or reflexive, and for a moment they were looking at each other through a pane of hospital glass, across the length of a morning that had rearranged everything between them. Then he looked away first and kept walking, and she watched him go through the door at the end of the corridor with the federal agents 1 step behind him on each side. She was still looking at that door when Greer appeared at her elbow. "Dr. Fenn wants you," Greer said. Dalton's responsive. Emily turned. Sergeant First Class Dalton was not fully conscious. The sedation was still doing its work, but his eyes were open to slits, and he was tracking movement, and when Emily stepped to the bedside and said his name, his gaze moved to her face and held there. "You're at Blackstone Medical," she said quietly, steadily. "You're stable. You're going to be okay." His lips moved. No sound. He tried again. The word was barely air. He tried once more. "My team. Your team is here. Everyone came home today." His eyes closed. The monitor continued its steady testimony. Fenn was at the other side of the bed, noting responsiveness in the chart with the careful satisfaction of someone whose professional prediction had been borne out by reality. Emily stood at the bedside and let herself believe for the first time since 7:14 in the morning that this particular version of today was going to end the way it needed to end. And then her phone rang. Not Osei, not Ferrant, not any number she recognized. She stepped into the corridor and answered. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, not a voice she knew. "Miss Brooks, my name is Arthur Gaines. I'm the General Counsel for Veritas Meridian Group." A pause, perfectly calibrated. "I understand you've had a difficult day. I'm calling because I think there are some significant misunderstandings about Dr. Mercer's role that I'd like to help clarify, on a private basis, before this situation gets any more complicated for everyone involved." She stood very still. "I think," Gaines continued, his voice carrying the smooth, structural confidence of a man who had spent his career making problems disappear, "that if we could speak frankly, just the 2 of us, I could offer you some information that would be very helpful to your position going forward. Information that the federal investigation may not have access to yet. Another pause. I'd also like to discuss a settlement figure that I think you'd find quite meaningful. She looked back through the SICU glass at Dalton, at the monitor, at Greer writing in the chart. How did you get this number? She said. I have resources, Gaines said pleasantly. Miss Brooks, I want to help you. Nathan Mercer made decisions that I'm prepared to help you hold him accountable for. But there are aspects of this situation that are more complex than the federal investigators understand, and if you'll agree to a private conversation, I believe we can reach an arrangement that is substantially in your favor. She thought about the financial records in Terry Olt's folder, 18 months of quarterly payments, the compound access logs, Sutter's 4-hour statement, the charter flight booked a week ago from a private airfield 40 minutes outside Redwood Falls. She thought about Arthur Gaines calling her private number within 90 minutes of Mercer's arrest to offer her money for a private conversation before the investigation could reach whatever he was actually calling about. Mr. Gaines, she said. Yes. Don't call this number again. She ended the call, walked back into the SICU bay, and pulled up Osei's number. He answered on the first ring. Veritas Meridian's general counsel just called me, she said. Arthur Gaines. He offered me a settlement and asked for a private conversation before the investigation reaches something he described as more complex than the federal investigators understand. 3 seconds of silence. What number did he call you on? Osei's voice had sharpened in a way she hadn't heard from him before. She read it back. Another silence, longer. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled in the specific way of someone controlling something that wanted very much to move faster. That number is not in any public record connected to your name. It's your DOD Emergency Design A contact number. It was issued to you at 7:50 this morning. He paused. It was only distributed within our coordination chain. She heard what that meant. Someone in your chain gave it to Veritas Meridian, she said. Yes, Osei said. And I need to know exactly who that was before anyone in this building takes another step. The silence on Osei's end lasted exactly 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, Emily understood that the investigation she'd been standing at the edge of all day had just grown a new perimeter. Someone inside the coordination chain had passed her emergency contact number to the general counsel of a company whose primary consultant was currently in federal custody. That was not a leak. That was architecture. The same kind of deliberate, pre-positioned architecture that had routed a nerve agent casualty to a surgeon who'd signed a classified protocol and booked a charter flight a week in advance. Veritas Meridian had not panicked when Mercer was arrested. They had activated a contingency. Stay in the SICU, Osei said. Don't go anywhere without telling me first. Don't speak to anyone you haven't already spoken to today. You think there's someone else in the building? I think Arthur Gaines did not call you to be helpful, Osei said. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She put the phone in her pocket and stood in the SICU corridor and did what she'd learned to do in situations where the ground was shifting and action wasn't yet available, she observed. The floor around her, the people on it, the rhythms that were normal and the small discordances that weren't. A hospital floor had a texture to it, a particular acoustic and visual pattern that a person who'd worked it long enough could read the way you read a room when you walk in and know before anyone speaks that something is wrong. Nothing looked wrong. That, she had learned today, was not reassuring. She went back to Dalton's bedside. His eyes were closed again. The responsiveness from 20 minutes ago had given way to the deep functional sleep of a body redirecting every available resource toward repair. His monitor was steady. His color, in the afternoon light coming through the SICU window, was approaching something that looked like the color of a living person rather than the color of a person who had almost stopped being one. She checked the atropine drip, checked the pulse ox, logged both. Greer was at the station outside, and Emily caught her eye through the glass and held it for a moment, just long enough to communicate, in the shorthand that develops between people who've shared a difficult shift, that things were not entirely settled and Greer should be alert. Greer gave a single nod and turned back to her chart with the particular posture of someone who has become more attentive without making a performance of it. Osei arrived in 9 minutes. He came through the SYCU door with Terriolt behind him, and the woman Emily had seen earlier on the phone in the conference room. She had a name now, Agent Rosa Cardenas, FBI Financial Crimes, and she had the focused energy of someone who had been waiting all day for a specific thread to pull. The number was distributed to 7 people within our coordination chain, Terriolt said, without preamble. Wolf, myself, Osei, Ferris, Cardenas, the communications officer attached to Wolf's escort team, and the DoD contracting office duty officer who processed the emergency designation. He looked at Emily. The duty officer's name is Major Philip Rowan. He processed your designation at 7:52 this morning. He also, we've just confirmed, received a direct deposit of $43,000 into a personal account 12 days ago from a shell entity we've been tracking in the Veritas Meridian Financial Network. The shape of it completed itself. Not Mercer alone. Not a surgeon and a charter flight and a convenient OR. A network. People at different nodes of the apparatus, each doing a specific contained thing, each maintaining plausible distance from the whole. Roan at the DoD contracting office. Mercer at the hospital. Gaines managing the perimeter, ready to move when the primary plan failed. The call to Emily wasn't about settling with her. It was about finding out how much she knew and how far the federal reach had extended before Gaines decided what to burn and what to save. She had ended the call before giving him a single word of useful information. Rowan has been contacted, Cardenas said. She had a clipped, direct delivery that Emily appreciated. He's not talking, but the financial connection is documented independently of his cooperation, so it doesn't matter. She paused. What matters is that Gaines calling you tells us Veritas Meridian believes the investigation is further along than they can manage through Mercer's silence alone. They're in damage containment mode. Which means, Osei said, that there's something in the evidence chain they're trying to get ahead of. The bag, Emily said. Everyone looked at her. Sutter went for the bag. Not for any of the documents in this building, not for the clinical records, not for the financial files. He went for the patient intake bag. Which means whatever Dalton's unit extracted from that site, the physical documentation, it contains something that isn't replicable through Veritas Meridian's own records, something they can't reconstruct or contest if it reaches federal hands intact. Ferris, who had appeared in the doorway behind Cardenas, looked at Terriolt. The bag is in federal custody, Terriolt said. Has been since Sutter surrendered it in the parking structure. Chain of custody is documented. Has it been opened? Not yet. We were waiting for Aberdeen to send a CBRN clearance team. The bag may have compound residue from field contact. He paused. Clearance team arrives at 1700. 2 hours. She looked at the corridor window. Outside, the afternoon had deepened. The October light was doing the thing it did in the later hours. Everything slightly amber, shadows longer and more definite, the day starting to commit to its ending. Then that's the timeline Gaines is working against, she said. Whatever's in that bag, he has 2 hours to do something about it before it's in an open federal evidence file. He can't get to the bag, Osei said. He doesn't need to get to the bag. He needs to get to the case. Emily looked at Ferris. Is there any mechanism, legal challenge, emergency injunction, anything in the federal procedural architecture that could delay the opening of that bag? Ferris looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, and then looked at Cardenas. Walk me through the grounds for emergency protective order in a classified evidence scenario, Cardenas said, and she was already moving toward the corridor, already on her phone, and Emily understood that the question had been the right one to ask. Osei stayed. He sat in the chair beside Dalton's bay door, the same chair Emily had been in and out of all day, and he looked at the monitor for a moment before he spoke. You doing all right? The question surprised her. Not its content, its timing, its tone, the specific human register of it, dropping the investigative frequency for a second into something simpler. I've had easier Tuesdays, she said. He almost smiled, not quite. When this is over, the immediate part of it, there's going to be a period of formal proceedings where your testimony is central. I want you to know that Ferris's office will provide support for that. Preparation, legal guidance, whatever you need. I'm not worried about the proceedings. She was looking at Dalton. I'm worried about the next time. The next person who gets routed to the wrong surgeon because someone built a financial arrangement around their death. Osei was quiet. This wasn't the first deployment of that compound, she said. Prescott said they'd been tracking its development for 14 months. Aberdeen said it was field deployed for the first time this morning, but development means testing. Testing means prior exposure somewhere. She looked at Osei. Were there other casualties? He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, that's part of an ongoing investigation, which meant yes. She sat with that for a while. Let it be what it was. The anger that came with it was not hot. She'd run through the hot version of this particular anger years ago in a forward base in Helmand, and what was left of it now was something more functional, a cold-directed thing that knew what to do with itself. At 4:47, Ferris came back to the SYCU. Gaines filed for an emergency protective order in federal district court 40 minutes ago, he said, claiming the bag constitutes proprietary research material subject to IP protection under the Defense Contractor Classification Framework. He looked at Emily. Judge Alora Mass denied it in 11 minutes. She noted in the denial that the filing appeared designed to obstruct a federal criminal investigation rather than protect legitimate IP interests, and she referred the filing itself for bar review. 11 minutes. Somewhere a federal judge had looked at the architecture of what Veritas Meridian was doing and had called it by its name without being asked to. Is Gaines being charged? Emily asked. Obstruction of justice is being reviewed. The referral to bar review is a separate track. He's not in custody yet. Ferris paused. Yet. The CBRN clearance team from Aberdeen arrived at 5:03. 2 specialists in partial protective gear, carrying equipment cases that looked nothing like anything in a hospital's standard inventory. They went directly to the secure room where the bag was being held. The floor was quiet around their arrival, the particular institutional quiet of a building that has been absorbing extraordinary events all day and has reached its saturation point. Emily was at the nurse's station when the call came from Aberdeen. Not Ferris, not Osei. Prescott directly, the voice she'd first heard through her car window in the employee parking lot while the day was still deciding what it was going to be. The bag is clear of active compound residue. We're opening it now. A pause, sounds in the background she couldn't identify. Ms. Brooks, I want to tell you something before I tell you what we're finding. What you did this morning, the clinical identification, the protocol application under those conditions. I've been in this field for 22 years. What you did was exceptional. I want that said clearly, on a call I'm aware is being recorded. What's in the bag? She said. A longer pause. Pages turning, she thought, or the sound of people looking at physical documents and understanding what they're looking at. Drive containing field-recorded documentation of 3 prior deployment events, Prescott said. Preliminary assessment suggests compound exposure incidents in 2 prior operational theaters. There are also printed communications, internal Veritas Meridian communications, discussing casualty management protocols for test events. His voice was still measured. Under the measurement, something that was not measured at all. They were tracking the outcomes, adjusting the compound formulation based on how long it took people to die and how the military medical system responded. She closed her eyes for a second. 3 prior events. People in forward positions, in operational theaters, who had presented with a compound exposure that no one around them was equipped to identify, who had died in circumstances that generated after-action reports and field incident documentation and grief in units that kept moving because units always kept moving. How many? She asked. 11 casualties across 3 events, all listed in after-action records as KIA from blast injury. He stopped. They weren't. She opened her eyes. The nurse's station. The monitor through the SICU glass. Dalton's steady heartbeat. 12, she thought. 11, and then Dalton, who had not become the 12th because she had been in a corridor she'd been ordered to leave and had refused. Thank you for telling me, she said. The documentation is ironclad, Prescott said. This ends Veritas Meridian, the company, the program, the people who ran it, all of it. She believed him. She also understood that ending something in the legal and institutional sense was a process measured in years, not in the single day that was now moving through its final hours. and that the 11 people in those after-action reports had families who were going to learn something that would rearrange every understanding they had of how their person had died. That was not a clean ending. That was justice, with a very high cost, which was the only kind that existed when the wrong being corrected was this size. She passed the information to Osei, who was on his phone within 30 seconds, and then she went back to Dalton's bedside and stood there, and let herself feel the full weight of the day without trying to manage it into something more bearable than it was. At 6:15, Nathan Mercer was formally charged. She didn't hear about it in a dramatic way. Turiol came to the SICU and told her, factually and without theater, that the federal charges had been filed. Conspiracy to commit murder, violation of the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act as applied to chemical agents, obstruction of justice, wire fraud across the Veritas Meridian financial arrangement, and a series of additional charges that would be refined as the investigation developed. His hospital privileges had been permanently revoked by the medical board within the same hour, the board having been briefed by Ferris's office and having moved with an unusual and perhaps unprecedented speed that suggested even institutional bodies could recognize when something was unambiguous. Mercer was in a federal holding facility outside Redwood Falls. He had still said nothing. His lawyer, a different lawyer than whoever had fielded the first hours, had issued a single statement asserting his client's intention to vigorously defend against all charges. She thought about the way he'd said, "You're a nurse in the trauma bay this morning," the deliberate selection of the word, the precise use of it as a diminishment, a category that meant less than his category, a credential that canceled out rather than added to the information she was offering. She thought about the 8 hours between that moment and this one. Richard Holloway's situation resolved differently and more slowly, and in some ways more honestly than Mercer's. He was not charged criminally that day. The case against him was one of institutional failure and deliberate incuriosity rather than active conspiracy. And those distinctions mattered legally even when they didn't matter morally. What happened to him instead was a cascade of institutional consequences that were in some ways more thorough than a single criminal charge. The DoD contract compliance audit launched officially at 5 p.m., which placed the hospital's military contract in immediate suspension. The hospital board, convening an emergency session that Emily didn't attend and didn't need to, accepted Holloway's resignation by 6:45. The terms of his departure included full cooperation with the federal investigation and a prohibition on serving in hospital administration within the DoD contractor network for a period of no less than 10 years. He was not destroyed. He would recover, in the diminished way that people recover from institutional disgrace when they have resources and connections that most people don't. She knew that, and she didn't like it, and she accepted it as the real texture of how these things ended. Not perfectly, not cinematically, but with enough consequence to matter and enough documentation to follow him. Kyle Sutter, Mercer's resident, was a more complicated thing. His cooperation had been complete and immediate. His statement had provided the investigative chain with connections that would have taken weeks to establish otherwise. And he was 27 years old and had spent 8 months being slowly recruited into something he didn't fully understand by someone he trusted and needed. His legal fate was going to be determined by people with more standing than Emily to make that determination, and she stayed out of it. What she thought about, when she thought about him at all, was the parking structure. The fact that he had driven there and stopped. That he had sat with the bag on the passenger seat and not left. Whatever had moved in him in those minutes between the intake lockup and the parking structure was not nothing, and she held that without deciding what it meant, because she had learned, slowly, imperfectly, over 30 years, that the space between wrong and irredeemable was larger than institutions usually acknowledged. At 7:20, Sergeant Dalton opened his eyes. Really opened them this time. Not the slitted tracking responsiveness of 2 hours ago, but a full present awakening, the eyes of a person who knew where they were and was orienting to it. He looked at the ceiling first, then at the monitor, then at Emily, who was at his bedside because she'd been cycling back to it all evening, the way you cycle back to something you can't fully release. "Hey," he said. His voice was rough, barely there, but it was a real voice. "Hey," she said back. He looked at his arm, at the lines, at the IV stand. He was doing the inventory that people do when they wake up in places they don't remember arriving at, accounting for themselves, checking the evidence of their own body for information about what had happened to it. "My shoulder," he said. "Repaired. Dr. Fenn's work. It'll need rehabilitation, but the structure is intact." He absorbed that. "The other thing." She looked at him. "You had a chemical exposure from the device at the extraction site. We reversed it. You're going to need monitoring for another 24 hours, and there may be some residual effects we'll track over the next few weeks, but the acute phase is over." He was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked the way jaws work when someone is deciding how much of what they feel is appropriate to show to a stranger. "I remember the OR," he said. "Parts of it. Alarms. Yes. I remember a woman's voice on the intercom. She didn't say anything." "That was you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He looked at the window, the evening dark outside it, the reflection of the SICU bay superimposed over the city lights beginning to show in the distance. "They told me. The general told me what happened before they let Cora in." He stopped. Cora, his wife. "He told me everything." She waited. "I want to say thank you," he said, "but I've been trying to figure out what that means for something this size, and I don't—" He stopped again. His eyes were doing something he was working not to let them do, and she respected the effort without helping him manage it. "I have a daughter," he said. "I know, Ellie." Something moved through his face. "She's 6 weeks old. I left when she was 4 weeks." He swallowed. "I was going to be home in 3 more days." Emily looked at this man, his rough voice, the lines in his arm, the monitor recording the heartbeat that had flatlined at 7:30-something that morning, and felt something that was not a clean feeling, not triumph, not relief, something older and more complicated, the specific weight of having stood at the exact point where things go one way or the other and having pushed in the right direction with everything she had, knowing that the pushing was not guaranteed and that she had been in positions before where she'd pushed just as hard, and it hadn't been enough. 11 times it hadn't been enough. Before today. 11 people she would never meet, and after-action reports she would never read, whose families were going to get phone calls in the days ahead that would break them in ways that couldn't be repaired. "Go home," she said. "When you're cleared, go home and stay there for a while." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the ma'am was genuine, not formal, the kind that came from a place of actual meaning, and she let herself receive it. His wife came in at 7:45. Emily left them alone. She was at the nurses' station, updating the chart for the last time before she handed over to the evening team when Wolf found her. He had his dress uniform back on. The day was moving into its official phase. The phase where things that had been happening became part of the institutional record, where the extraordinary compressed itself into documentation and proceedings and the formal language of consequence. He looked tired, not diminished. Tired in the way of a man who had used everything he had and was measuring the result. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked up. "When you were removed from that operating room this morning, I was in that building. I was on this floor. I arrived before Dalton did." He looked at her steadily. "I should have intervened earlier. I didn't, because I was still assessing the situation, and I calculated that moving too early would compromise the investigation's standing. That calculation was wrong. It nearly cost Sergeant Dalton his life." She hadn't known that he'd been in the building before the alarms. She absorbed it. The imperfect thing inside the morning she'd been carrying as a story of her own. The discovery that the general's arrival had not been accidental or lucky, but measured and delayed, and that the measurement had had its own cost. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve the whole picture," he said. "And because I don't believe in building the narrative of someone's courage on a version of events that omits the part where the system that should have protected them failed to." She held his gaze for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. And then, "I'd like to talk to you about something else." He talked. She listened. And what he described was this: a newly authorized unit within the Army's medical command structure, designated to respond to chemical and non-standard weapons casualties in both forward and domestic operational contexts. A unit that existed because the events of the last 14 months, the compound's development, the prior casualties, the gap in the system that had let 11 people die before anyone understood what was killing them, had made clear that the existing architecture was insufficient. A unit that needed, at its foundation, people who understood battlefield toxicology not from a manual, but from the specific and irreplaceable education of having been present when it mattered and having gotten it right. He was asking her to help build it, not to join it as a subordinate, to help design it, the protocols, the training framework, the clinical criteria for field identification of compounds that weren't yet in any database, because the people making them kept making new ones. He was asking her because he'd watched her do, under conditions designed to prevent her from doing it, the exact thing this unit needed to exist to do. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's not a limitation in my assessment. That's a qualification." She thought about that. She thought about the 14 months she'd spent on this floor, being useful and being dismissed in roughly equal measure, the daily negotiation between what she knew and what the people above her were willing to hear. She thought about the 3 men in Helmand and the 11 people in the after-action reports, and Dalton with his 6-week-old daughter, and the voice she'd heard on the intercom at 7:14 saying, "Stay out of my operating room." She thought about what it would mean to build the system that would make the next version of this morning go differently. "I want it in writing," she said. "The scope of authority. Clinical decision-making standing, not advisory. If I'm building protocols, I need standing to enforce them." Wolf almost smiled. "I expected that. And I want Prescott at Aberdeen involved. He knows this compound class better than anyone in the architecture right now, and if we're building something that has to stay ahead of what Veritas Meridian was developing, we need his depth." Already intended. And the unit has to have a reporting structure that doesn't run through any node that was part of the current network. Clean chain. If we're starting over, we actually start over. Agreed. She looked at the SICU bay. At Dalton's window, where the shape of his wife was visible at the bedside, leaning close, the particular posture of someone who has been terrified for hours and is now doing the physical work of confirming that the person is real and present and still here. "Okay," Emily said. "Yes." The paperwork didn't happen that night. It happened over the following weeks, informal sessions and reviewed drafts, and one particularly difficult meeting where a DoD attorney tried to limit the clinical authority scope, and Emily declined the limitation clearly and without raising her voice, and Wolf, who was present, said nothing and let her handle it, which was its own kind of message about what the next phase of things was going to look like. What happened that night was simpler. She finished her chart documentation. She handed over to the evening shift, a competent, unhurried nurse named Terrence who asked good questions and listened to the answers. She said goodbye to Greer, who was still there despite being 3 hours past her shift end, and Greer said, "See you tomorrow," which was the closest thing to acknowledgement that the day had meant something that Emily was going to receive from that particular quarter, and it was enough. She took the elevator down, walked through the lobby, past the reception desk and the coffee concession, and the families that had been there in some configuration all day, the ordinary human traffic of a building where difficult things happened and people kept arriving anyway because the alternative was not arriving. Outside. The night air was cold in the specific way of October in Redwood Falls, sharp, carrying the smell of something nearby burning leaves, the particular clarity that comes when summer has fully released its claim on the season. She stood on the hospital steps. She'd stood here this morning after they'd walked her out, with her hands empty and the suspension email on her phone and the knowledge that Dalton's atropine window was narrowing. She'd stood here and looked at the parking lot and done the accounting of what she had and what she'd lost and what she was going to do about it. She thought about that version of herself. Not with pity. She didn't have much use for retrospective pity, her own or anyone else's. With something more like recognition. The woman who'd stood here at 9-something in the morning Outside the building they'd made her leave, making the decision to go back in through a loading dock because a man on the third floor needed her more than the institution needed her gone. That decision had not been made from certainty. She wanted to be honest about that, because honesty about the texture of courage was the only version of it that meant anything. She had not been sure it would work. She had not been confident in the outcome. She had been scared, in the functional way that scared operates when it coexists with knowing what to do. Not paralyzing, but present, and she had gone back in anyway, because what she knew and what she could do existed independent of whether anyone in that building was willing to acknowledge it. That was the thing. That had always been the thing. What you know doesn't require permission. What you can do doesn't stop being real because someone with more institutional authority tells you it isn't. The woman they'd tried to walk out of that building this morning was the same woman who'd kept 3 soldiers alive in a forward position in Helmand with supplies designed for a different crisis. The same woman who'd come home from deployment and enrolled in nursing school because she wanted to keep doing the work with different tools. The same woman who'd spent 14 months on a trauma floor being useful and underestimated and who had never, not once, confused being underestimated with being wrong. They had tried to make those the same thing today. They had tried very hard with institutional authority and legal paperwork and physical removal to make her uncertainty about her own standing translate into uncertainty about what she knew. It hadn't worked. She didn't think it was because she was exceptional. She thought it was because she'd had enough practice in enough difficult rooms to know the difference between a real limit and a manufactured one. The real limit was what she didn't know. She held that seriously. The manufactured limit was what someone with power needed her to believe so she'd stay out of the way. She had learned to hold that differently. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ferrant, Dalton's teammate, the man in the field jacket who'd told her about the device in 45 seconds that had mattered more than any others. He's awake, talking, complaining about the food. You know what that means? She did know. It meant the particular kind of alive that was louder and more demanding than the quiet fight of the SICU. It meant the thing had worked. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without the shadow of 11 other outcomes that hadn't, but for the man in that room with his wife and his new daughter's name in his chest like a compass point, it had worked. She typed back, "Tell him the food gets worse before it gets better." She put the phone in her pocket, walked to her car. The parking lot was quiet, her footsteps on the asphalt, the ambient hum of the city at night. She sat in the driver's seat, and this time she started the engine because there was somewhere to go. Home. And then tomorrow, and then the work of building something that might mean the next time a soldier arrived at a hospital with a compound. No one in the room recognized. There would be someone who recognized it, and that someone would have the standing to act on what they knew. She backed out of the space. The hospital receded in her rearview mirror, lit from inside, the windows of the trauma wing and the SICU and the floors above them casting pale rectangles against the October dark. A building where difficult things happened, where people kept arriving. She had arrived this morning at 6:40, 20 minutes before her shift, because she had never once been the kind of person who rolled in at the last second. She was not the same version of that person who was leaving now. She was the version that knew, with a precision she hadn't had this morning, what she was capable of in the moments that counted. Not a comfortable knowledge, not a triumphant one, the real kind, earned in the hardest way things get earned, in a corridor with alarms going off and no authority backing her up, and a man on the other side of a door who was running out of time. She knew who she was, They had tried very hard today to make her forget, and she had not forgotten. And tomorrow she was going to start building something to make sure the forgetting didn't happen to the next person who stood in that corridor with something true in their hands and no one willing to listen. That was enough. That was everything. She drove home through the dark streets of Redwood Falls, and the city moved around her, ordinary and indifferent and alive, and she let it. Some people are dismissed not because they lack value, but because their value threatens the comfortable order of things. The question has never been whether you know enough. It has always been whether you trust what you know when everyone around you is telling you to doubt it. That is harder than any credential. That is the thing they cannot take from you, even when they take everything else.